A second fire pit appeared beside theirs, already burning. At first, Daniel thought it was exhaustion playing tricks on him. The woods had that way of folding in on the senses after midnight, distance collapsing, shapes misbehaving. He blinked hard and leaned forward in his camp chair, the aluminum legs creaking under his weight. Their own fire pit sat in the shallow ring of stones they'd built an hour earlier, a modest flame gnawing at two split logs. Beyond it, just 3 feet to the left where there had been only trampled pine needles and dirt, a second circle of stones glowed with heat. Flames rose from it in a steady, patient column, orange licked with blue at the base. Mara followed his gaze. "Did you?" she began, then stopped. The clearing was small, a ragged opening in a forest that seemed too dense for its own good. The trees crowded close, trunks blackened by the dark, their upper branches knitting together overhead. The sky showed only in thin, fractured slivers. They had chosen the site because it was far from the trail and even farther from the road, a place where no one would wander by accident. The night was cold enough that each breath felt like it shaved something from the inside of the lungs. It smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of the nearby creek. Crickets had been chirping steadily, but now their rhythm faltered, as if they were listening too. Daniel stood slowly. The second fire pit did not flicker uncertainly or sputter like something just lit. It burned as though it had been tended for hours. The stones around it were blackened, cracked with heat. A half-consumed log rested across the center, glowing red along its spine. "We didn't build that," Mara said. Her voice was careful, as if loud words might invite something closer. "No." The dirt between the two pits was undisturbed. No footprints cut through the soft soil. No drag marks, no scattered stones. The ground looked like it had always been this way. 2 circles of rock side by side, twin hearts beating in the clearing. Daniel crouched, extending a hand toward the second fire. Heat pressed against his palm. Real. Intense. He could feel the moisture leaving his skin. "Maybe someone was here before," he said, though the explanation felt thin even to him. "Maybe we didn't see it." Mara shook her head. She was meticulous. She'd walked the perimeter twice before they set up the tent. She would have noticed a fire pit 3 feet from where they planned to sit. The flames in the second pit shifted then, not with wind. There was none, but as if stirred from beneath. Shadows snapped long and skeletal across the clearing. For a moment, Daniel thought he saw something inside the blaze, a shape interrupting the coals, a darker silhouette that did not belong to wood. He blinked, and it was gone. "Let's just put it out," Mara said. "If someone's nearby, they'll come back for it." They fetched the collapsible water container from the cooler. The creek was a short walk downhill, and Daniel hated the idea of leaving the firelight, but he forced himself to step beyond the ring of illumination. The forest swallowed him immediately. The darkness was thick and tactile, brushing against his face, filling his ears with a low, almost electrical hush. He kept expecting to hear movement, boots against leaves, a branch snapping under weight, but there was only the distant burble of water. When he returned, Mara stood rigid, staring at the second fire pit. "It's closer," she said. Daniel almost laughed, a brittle sound that didn't escape his throat. It can't be, but it was. The space between the two pits had narrowed. The dirt that had been visible moments before was gone, replaced by overlapping halos of light. Their chairs, which had been angled toward their own fire, now seemed oriented between the two. "You moved them?" he asked. "No." He poured water into the second pit. Steam roared upward, a violent hiss tearing through the clearing. The flames recoiled, guttered, and died. Smoke poured out, thick and bitter. They waited. The smoke thinned. Beneath it, the embers glowed stubbornly, then dulled to black. The stones cracked softly as they cooled. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Behind him, something popped. He turned. Their own fire flared high, sudden and bright, sparks spiraling upward into the narrow slices of sky. And beside it, no, not beside it. Beyond it now, on the opposite side, A third ring of stones blazed into existence. Not built, not placed, just there. Mara's fingers dug into his sleeve. We need to leave. The word leave seemed to sink into the soil and vanish. The trees leaned inward, trunks indistinguishable from shadow. The clearing felt smaller, compressed by the twin pillars of flame. They kicked dirt over their own fire in frantic, uneven scoops. The flames resisted, licking at the soil as if tasting it. Daniel grabbed a branch and shoved it into the pit, scattering embers. The second, no third fire burned on, steady and indifferent. When at last their fire was reduced to a smoking ruin, they stepped back. The remaining blaze illuminated only one pit now, the one that had not been theirs. It had moved again. It stood directly in front of the tent. The nylon walls glowed orange, translucent. Daniel could see the outline of their sleeping bags inside, two narrow shapes side by side. The light cast long, writhing shadows across the fabric, shadows that did not correspond to the stones or logs in the pit. They corresponded to something taller, something upright. Daniel felt it then, the sensation that had been building since the first impossible circle appeared. The certainty of eyes. Not from the tree line, not from behind a trunk, but from within the firelight itself. The flames bent inward, as if drawn toward a center that was not wood. The shadows stretched, fused, and then separated again, wrong in their proportions. A head too narrow, shoulders too long. Mara whispered his name. The air grew colder despite the heat. His breath fogged, white against the orange glow. The crickets had fallen completely silent. He took a step backward and collided with their cooler. The mundane thud felt obscene in the charged stillness. The fire pit shifted, not sliding, not dragged. The ground beneath it seemed to ripple, the way heat distorts air over asphalt. The stones wavered, blurred, and then there were two pits again, flanking the tent like sentries. "We're being herded," Mara said. The word landed heavy. Daniel grabbed the car keys from the folding table. The vehicle was parked 100 yards up the narrow dirt track. Too far. The path to it threaded between trees that now looked like ribs in a carcass. They edged toward the opening in the trees, keeping the fires in sight. The pits remained where they were, burning without crackle, without the organic chatter of normal flame. The light they cast seemed directional, following them in thin, stretching bands. At the edge of the clearing, Daniel made the mistake of looking back fully. The two pits were gone. In their place stood a single, enormous ring of stones encircling the entire campsite. It burned in an unbroken circle, a wall of fire rising waist-high. The tent sat at its center like an offering. Inside the ring, shadows moved, not cast by the trees, but contained within the fire itself, pacing along the inner edge. The heat rolled outward in waves, but it did not warm him. It felt like breath against the back of his neck. Mara's grip on his hand tightened painfully. The ring began to contract. The stones did not scrape or grind. They simply existed closer than before. The flames leaned inward, hungry and deliberate. Daniel stumbled back into the clearing, forced by the tightening circle. The forest beyond had disappeared into a blackness so complete it looked solid, impenetrable. The fire closed in, reducing the world to a shrinking island of dirt and nylon and smoke. Within the blaze, the upright shadows grew clearer. They were not quite human. Their limbs bent at wrong angles, elongating as the circle shrank. Faces hovered where flame should be, pale spaces untouched by light. Mara made a small, broken sound. The tent fabric began to smoke. Daniel felt a terrible understanding settle over him. Not that the fire would burn them, but that it would replace them. That by morning, if morning came, there would be two neat sleeping bags in the center of a cold ring of stones, and somewhere just beyond the tree line, a new pair of campers would find a second fire pit already burning beside their own. The circle tightened to a diameter no wider than their outstretched arms. The flames rose higher, merging overhead, sealing off the sky, and in the final narrowing of space, as the shadows leaned inward and the heat pressed against his eyes, Daniel saw their silhouettes join the others, thin, wavering shapes etched into the firelight, standing calmly within the blaze, waiting for the next clearing to appear. The forest floor was warm, as if something massive had just passed beneath it. Caleb said it quietly, almost to himself, but the words seemed to settle differently in the clearing. Mina looked up from the camp stove. What? He shifted his weight and pressed his boot harder into the soil. The warmth wasn't imagined. It seeped through rubber and wool, subtle but undeniable, like pavement after a long summer day. It's warm, he repeated. They had hiked in late to avoid the weekend crowd, following an unmarked spur that Caleb remembered from a trip years ago. The trail had narrowed to nothing, then to suggestion, then to instinct. The clearing they found was small and nearly circular, enclosed by old hemlocks whose trunks rose straight and pale in the dimming light. A fallen log bordered one edge. A shallow creek murmured somewhere downslope. The air now was cold enough to fog their breath. Mina stood and crossed the few steps between the stove and where he stood. She crouched and pressed her bare fingers to the dirt. Her eyebrows knit together. That's not right. The top layer of earth felt like skin. Not hot, not scalding, just alive with retained heat. When Caleb scraped aside a thin layer of pine needles, cooler soil lay immediately beneath. The warmth was only at the surface, as though something had brushed close beneath it and left a trace. Sun pocket, Mina offered. Maybe it holds heat longer here. There wasn't any sun. Look at the canopy. Above them, the branches interlocked so densely that twilight arrived early and lingered. The clearing was less an opening than a thinning. Even at midday, light would have been filtered and weak. Caleb stood and slowly turned in place. The warmth extended across the entire clearing. He walked toward the fallen log and pressed his palm down again. Still warm. The smell of the forest seemed sharper suddenly. Sap and damp bark and something else underneath. A mineral scent, like wet stone dragged from deep underground. Do you smell that? He asked. Mina inhaled, then nodded slowly. Like a cave. The word lingered between them. A soft tremor moved through the soil. It was faint enough that Caleb might have dismissed it as his own shifting weight, but the cook pot hanging from the small tripod rattled gently against its hook. They both stared at it. The tremor faded. The forest beyond the clearing was very still. No wind threaded the branches. No insects buzzed. The creek's murmur had diminished to a distant suggestion. Probably a truck, Mina said, though there were no roads within miles. Or something falling far off. Caleb wanted to agree. He wanted to assign it a name and let the name make it small. Instead, he walked to the edge of the clearing where the underbrush thickened. He knelt and pressed his hand into the ground just beyond the circle of open space. Cool. He moved a foot back into the clearing. Warm. The boundary was precise. Mina. She joined him, and he guided her hand from cool to warm. The change was immediate. It's just here, she whispered. The clearing felt less like a random break in the trees now and more like a mark. Place selected. They finished setting up in silence. The tent went up easily. Muscle memory carried them through familiar motions. Stakes slid into soil that yielded too readily. Caleb felt it each time the metal pierced down, resistance, then a soft give, as though something below shifted slightly to accommodate it. By the time they crawled inside, night had fully settled. The darkness beyond the thin nylon walls felt layered and thick. Caleb lay on his back and pressed his palm flat against the tent floor. The warmth radiated up into his skin. Mina turned toward him. It's stronger. He hadn't wanted to say it, but she was right. The heat had intensified, subtle but rising, like a fever. A low vibration began, deep and steady. It wasn't loud. It was felt more than heard, a resonance that filled his chest and made his teeth buzz faintly. The tent poles quivered. They both held still. The vibration swelled, then tapered off. From somewhere in the forest came a sudden crash, branches snapping in rapid succession. Then another farther off. Then a chorus of movement, heavy bodies forcing their way through brush. Deer, Mina whispered. Too many, Caleb said. The sounds circled wide around the clearing, never crossing into it. It was as if the animals had reached an invisible wall and diverted away. The air inside the tent grew warmer. Mina unzipped the door. Cool night air rushed in, sharp and clean. Caleb followed her out. The clearing looked unchanged, but the ground no longer seemed flat. It felt taut beneath his boots, stretched thin. Another tremor. This time it rolled beneath them in a slow, deliberate wave. The soil ahead of them split in a narrow line, no wider than a coin. Pine needles slid into the opening without a sound. The line extended, curving gracefully. It traced a wide arc across the clearing. Caleb watched, unable to look away. The arc continued until it formed a complete circle around their tent and stove. The ground inside the circle began to sink. Not collapse, sink evenly, as though lowered by unseen machinery. The tent tilted slightly as its stakes dragged against shifting soil. Mina, Caleb breathed. They stepped backward, crossing the thin seam just as the inner circle dropped several inches. The line widened, exhaling a warm breath of air that carried that same cave-like scent. The sunken section lowered further, forming a shallow basin. Their tent slid toward the center and came to rest. The vibration returned, stronger now. The basin deepened. The trees along the inner edge leaned inward, roots creaking as soil gave way. At the center of the depression, the ground cracked open. The earth parted in a clean, deliberate split. What lay beneath was not rock. It was smooth and dark, curved gently upward. It reflected the faint light of their headlamps with a muted sheen. Mina's fingers found Caleb's sleeve and gripped hard. The exposed surface shifted. The curve rose slowly, displacing more soil. The basin was not collapsing, it was being lifted. A ridge formed along the smooth surface, running in a long arc. It swelled, then separated. An opening, not a mouth, not exactly, but something like a lid pulling back. Within it was a depth so absolute it seemed to swallow light. Concentric textures lined its interior, contracting and expanding in slow, measured pulses. Caleb understood then. They were standing on it. The clearing was not an absence of trees. It was a thinning where the forest floor had grown over something immense and buried. The warmth surged again, now unmistakable. Blood heat. The opening widened. A single, enormous eye rolled into view beneath the thinning layer of soil. It pressed upward, displacing earth the way a fingertip presses against fabric from below. The thin veil of dirt over it cracked and fell away. The eye was vast, larger than their tent, its surface layered and ridged rather than smooth. It reflected their twin headlamp beams in fractured shards. Fixed on them, the vibration in the ground resolved into a sound, low and resonant. It vibrated through Caleb's bones and into his skull. Awareness. The trees beyond the clearing trembled as something shifted beneath them, extending far past what they could see. The forest floor rose and fell in distant, slow waves. The eye blinked. When it opened again, the basin began to rise. Soil flowed back over the curved surface as if drawn by gravity that did not belong to this world. The seam sealed behind it. Within moments, the clearing was flat again. Their tent lay skewed but intact. The stove had tipped over. The fallen log remained where it had been. The warmth faded gradually. Sound crept back into the forest in cautious increments. A single insect chirp, the faint trickle of the creek regaining volume. Mina's grip loosened, but neither of them moved. At the center of the clearing, where the ground had split, a faint circular impression remained. It was shallow, almost imperceptible. At its heart, delicate concentric patterns were etched into the soil, like the memory of an iris. Caleb swallowed and forced himself to look away. The ground beneath his boots gave one last, slow pulse. And far below, something vast shifted its gaze.